Hi, everyone. My name is Laura Tamblin-Watts, and I bring greetings from the Consumer Advisory Panel. And thanks, Mark, for your nice words. I'll make sure to bring them back. The Consumer Advisory Panel has been an integral part of FSRA from the beginning, and the Consumer Office, I just want to say, has been exemplary in bringing forward the ideas and some of the big questions that we need to have brought forward with regulation. So it is my profound privilege to host and moderate this actually really exciting panel. You don't always say that at regulator conferences, do you? But this one actually is. And so I have the honor of drawing your attention to the full bios, which you'll see online, but I will pull out just a couple of key points from it as well. So over here we have Stephen Sargent, and he's the founder of AirDropped. And you know, it's a really interesting title that he has. So we're going to talk a little bit about your title in the action. I'm giving you the heads up on that. Just let him know in advance. He's the founder of AirDropped, which is a content production house which helps blockchain companies, educational firms, and startups create exciting and contextual content for their audience. So what does that actually mean, right? It sounds really good. He's like the techie guy. That's what you need to know. He's like our crypto techie guy. And he's doing all kinds of work in terms of blockchain compliance. And if you don't know what blockchain is, ask your children. That's what I did anyway. He's also worked in a lot of industry consultings on cryptocurrency. And I know that that's a top issue that many of us are wrestling with. You know, it's a challenging one. So we're gonna put your feet to the fire a little bit on that. We also have online, and I'm so glad that you were able to join us today, Juan Carlos. And Juan Carlos is joining us from DC, although he is from Peru originally. And thank you so much for joining us as well. He's the Senior Financial Sector Policy Specialist. That's a good title right there, at the Consultative Group to Assist the Poor, which I'll call CGAP. And that is a financial inclusion group within the World Bank. And it's a think tank that is really thinking about how to bring financial inclusion, not just to North America, not just to one place or an urban environment, but actually how do we more broadly think about financial inclusion and economic security globally. So we've got some great questions for you about thinking about these things in a global initiatives. And I'm so pleased to introduce to you someone I've been talking to for about 2.5 years and just realized I'd never actually met her in person as I went to hug her, Dr. Supriya Syal, who is of course the Deputy Commissioner of Research, Policy and Education at the Financial Consumer Agency of Canada. And I've been a big fan of her work, both academic work as well as policy work for many years. So when you took the role of Deputy Commissioner a few years ago, there were cheers across the country. She's been working both in the innovation area as a chief scientist, and she comes from a background around behavioral psychology and neuroscience, which I think is quite fascinating. So our group today is really innovation, inclusion, and where are we going to go from here when it comes to the regulatory space? So we are also thinking of it from a consumer focus, which is sometimes, as we've heard, a hard thing to do. Many of us will have our inherent biases working in the sector. How is it that we can change hats and really see things from the common person on the street or the common person in the rural community and how they're interacting with their financial services? So I'm going to start from global down to local. So Juan Carlos, I hope we still have you there. And I wanted to bring in your work and understand it a little bit more from an international perspective. Tell us about CGAP. People probably know about the World Bank, but they probably don't know about your think tank. You got 2 minutes. Tell us everything we need to know about it.
Sounds good. Thank you very much, Laura. So CGAP, as we call it, is a global partnership of more than 30 development organizations. We operate like an independent think tank within the World Bank. Our mission is to empower poor people, especially women, to capture economic opportunities, access essential services, and build resilience through financial services. We work globally and test, learn, and develop innovative solutions through practical research and actively engaging with a range of partners that include policymakers, regulators, supervisors, financial institutions, consumer representatives. And we aim to build an inclusive, sustainable, and responsible financial system that helps people improve their financial health, move them out of poverty, and therefore contribute to overall global development goals.
So let me just build upon that. Let's start again from that global perspective. What are some of the key issues that you're seeing really emerging around the world, particularly in more diverse countries that are perhaps not in the first world as we often think about it?
Yeah, thanks for this question. Last year, we finalized a global research on emerging financial consumer risks, especially in the context of the increase of digital financial services that we observed significantly during the pandemic. We've seen increases in the scale of risks, especially related to fraud, data misuse, and redress.
Yeah.
For example, regarding
Well,
fraud,
yeah, those are pretty familiar conversation points, but perhaps at a different level in some of the other parts of the world, and really shows how our markets are so integrated. In the way that we've seen that COVID-19 integrates us all, so do things like crypto, and so do things like markets, and so do things like economic insecurity. So we're going to pull on that in a little bit more, but I'm going to turn over first to our Canadian perspective, so you get to have a quick coffee there for a minute. So Carlos has talked about some of the emerging trends that we're seeing globally. Let's talk a little bit about consumer risks here. And we've got a kind of a digital focus on you guys here. So maybe I'll start with you, Supriya. How are you seeing these emerging consumer risks show up in the Canadian marketplace? And what are your thoughts about what we need to do about that?
Thank you, and great to be here. So I'll say two things. One, move to sort of digitalization of the financial sector was ongoing well before the pandemic. What the pandemic did is accelerate it and then throw it into sharp relief. And what we've seen is this sort of very strong curve upward in the last 2.5 year period. And what that's doing from both financial literacy, consumer well-being perspective, and from a consumer protection policy perspective is having us look at, okay, well, how do we tread water in this new world, as it were? So the two things I want to mention are, one, in July of 2021, we issued our renewed National Financial Literacy Strategy. And the vision of the strategy is a Canada in which everyone can build financial resilience in an increasingly digital world. And that digital is a very specific insertion, because really there is no way to talk about money or financial services these days without, acknowledging that that's where it's happening and that's where people are at and that's where we need to be. And in the strategy, the way it's laid out, it speaks to key barriers that we need to remove for people, or key things that we need to add to the ecosystem to help consumers, and enhancing digital access and digital literacy are two key priorities of the strategy. So on the one hand, there's that piece of the national strategy and how we're trying to address gaps in individual consumers and groups of consumers' ability to interface with this new world. So we know, for instance, digital access, if you don't have digital access, it's obviously a problem. But even when you do have access, there are certain groups, older adults, for instance, who may not be equally adept or confident in making decisions online. And how do we really, how do we show up? What do we do? So that's one piece. The other side, I'll say, is really more from a policy perspective, and the piece, the thought that I want to share with you is that digitalization of financial services, just like the digitalization of most aspects of our social and economic lives, is not a neutral force. So on the one hand, it promises to help solve seemingly intractable problems that have been around for a very long time about access and inclusion and fairness to create value for consumers. On the other hand, there's fraud, exploitation, data breaches, lack of accessibility, algorithms that reinforce stereotypes and increase discrimination. I mean, I could go on. My point is that technology, as it solves old problems, sometimes tends to create new ones. And so our challenge as regulators is, how do we foster and even promote innovation in this context, while making sure that the hard-won consumer protections that in some cases have taken us 50 years to get to are not lost as we make this transition.
Yeah, technology isn't a sword or a shield. it's how you use it. And we know that as soon as we do one thing in our capital markets, the black capital markets are the black markets where people are exchanging information and frauds and so on, those are really a concerning thing, and they're going to be moving just as quickly as they ever were. So it's a balancing effect. We can't just, I think, turn our heads away from it. All right, I got to ask you about your title, because this is a pretty good one. Chief Web3 Officer. Okay, so I had never heard about this. And I think it's just starting to come into people's radars. But you have been involved in this for a really long time. So let's start first. What is the Web3?
So Web3 is an ecosystem that's based on decentralization, mostly on the blockchain. But the most important thing is that there's no centralized authority. So there's no law enforcement, no regulators that can intervene. And Web 2, just to give you kind of a contradiction, is more about centralized platforms like your Instagrams, like your Twitters, that do have a centralized authority. And we've seen, with the Elon taking over Twitter, how sometimes government influences can dictate what is being presented or shown on those platforms. Now, most of us are like, well, we don't really need decentralization, but we see when we want to support Ukraine against the invasion in Russia, you can't just use GoFundMe to finance military-grade products. Right. You have to use things like Bitcoin, because decentralized platforms will only allow you to do certain things with value. And this is important. Much of us obviously are in Canada. We saw what happened with the Freedom Convoy. If you are donating to certain organizations, even if you do believe that it's your right to, the government can intervene and affect your financial situation.
I think decentralized is one of those words that really strikes a sort of stabbing wound in the hearts of regulators. But yes, come on, let's be honest, because it's not just antithetical to everything that we've ever done before, but it also feels a little bit like the Wild West, right? I mean, the whole point of it is to have a market that is a new and tight market. Now, you're an expert in digital first. You're an expert in things like crypto and blockchain, but you're also focused on things like compliance and money laundering. I'm really glad there's someone doing that. So at least there's you. That's good. As a person who's really thinking a lot about consumer issues, how do you bring a consumer focus to this sort of decentralized, I'm going to use the term Wild West there, and how do you think about balancing those freedoms with some of the brand new areas of consumer protection? And please, we're writing this down, so if you could just, tell us how to do that, that'd be great.
As the only person worried about compliance, I'm joking. I think what we have to focus on in consumer protection is mainly three areas. Market manipulation is huge. We've heard a lot of great conversations talk about today about financial planners, the insurance sector. Regulators have built some amazing guardrails in these situations that the organization in the industry can abide by. As you say, Web3 and cryptocurrency is a little more decentralized, so it is a place where there tends to be a lot more illicit activity, because even the regulators might not be up to date with how some of these decentralized protocols work. The second thing is lack of due diligence and greed. We saw with things like FTX that everybody wants to talk about today, is that there may have been some lack of due diligence. And even as a regular consumer, someone says, look at the price of Bitcoin. It went from 1,500 to 15,000. You feel like you're missing out. There's that FOMO, fear of missing out, where people want to invest blindly. And with Web3, there's this sense of urgency. So you have to act now, or you'll miss out on all these gains, or you'll miss out on getting an NFT. So people tend to move without having the time to do that due diligence. And the last thing is just a lack of technological understanding. We're going into an area where most people aren't comfortable. At my age, I'm 41 years old. This is very new to me as well. So we're going into an area where not even the regulators or law enforcement fully grasp the severity of some of these cases or the scams, because they just don't understand the way the blockchain works and the technology behind it.
Yeah, I knew to be worried about crypto when my 18-year-old son told me all about it and why I should invest. And this is a person who can't remember to take his hockey skates out of the car, let alone give me financial advice. And I think those behavioral economic pieces are really important. Okay, you've got a background in psychology, behavioral neuroscience. You've also done a ton of work on frauds and scams with the FCAC, and we know that this is not a thing that's going to go away anytime soon. They're getting constantly more sophisticated, right? How do you get people to pay attention to it? I mean, it's never ending. Do you have any sense about what might be some nudges or strategies to help bring behavioral economic focuses to those issues that are really everywhere now?
Yes, thank you. So, part of it, I think, is sort of understanding the circumstance that people are in or they find themselves in. So right now, for instance, we issued recently a consumer vulnerabilities report. And it speaks to what is happening to the financial consumer in Canada today. I mean, there's a lot of negative outcomes linked to, the state of the economy. People are low resilience, low well-being, turning to alternative high-cost lending. This creates a situation where the person who might not be equally susceptible to fraud in other circumstances is now more susceptible to fraud. So first thing I'll say is, I'll get to your behavioral science question, but just totally apart from that, I think we as regulators or as ecosystem stakeholders, whoever you are, whoever we are, need to just be more nimble in looking at what is actually happening right now in the world and then sort of responding to that. Now, your behavioral science question. So yes, people tend to have, an optimism bias, which is like, that's not going to happen to me. Or people tend to have a truth bias, particularly older adults who feel like, information that is deceptive isn't actually deceptive. Didn't work with my mom growing up, but it's documented fact. And so in terms of what can we do, so actually there's an example which I found quite compelling. So the Commodity Futures Trading Commission in the US has this social marketing initiative. It's called Smart Check. And what they're basically doing is taking these biases, so people, are optimistic, so they're confident about their own abilities, or they think that the information they're getting is truthful, and they're using them. So essentially, they've created behavioral nudges using social norming, which is saying, well, of course you know what you're doing, Laura. You should be confident, and savvy investors like you, they check to make sure they're not getting frauded. And that leads to, higher likelihood that people will actually pay attention, people will actually...
I respond very well to flattery. So that is, I think, going to be a thing that works really well for our house.
Yeah.
And I'll tell my son that maybe he should think twice about it. One of the things I want to pick up, you talked about some global initiatives that we're thinking about. Juan Carlos, I wanted to ask you, are there any places globally that are bringing some innovative perspectives, perhaps working with law enforcement or trying to find new ways of addressing these issues?
Yes, there is a big wave right now in terms of changing the approach to consumer protection from a more traditional perspective where the focus was on how providers comply with kind of prescriptive tick-the-box rules to a more outcomes-oriented approach where the focus is on the results of the provider actions on the actual consumers. And this entails, on the one hand, having regulation that is much more behaviorally informed, that has more testing of consumers, and supervision that is also more customer-centric. And a couple of examples that I can mention, in Kenya, for example, we conducted lab tests with a digital lender to show the effects of improved disclosure of loan repayment amounts on a mobile phone. The first disclosure showed just principal and fees all together. The second one separated the finance fees from the loan principal. Well, with this second option, consumers make better borrowing decisions, and their default rates on these first loan cycles in the lab setting decreased from 29% to 20%. We also tested the consequences of having a new screen in a mobile loan application menu, where they were presented with the active choice of viewing key terms and conditions right after selecting the request a loan option, instead of having this just as a last option in a large menu. This change of having a new screen increased viewership of terms and conditions from 9% to 24%, which in turn led to a 7 percentage point drop in delinquency rates in the lab experiment. So both experiments informed the Central Bank of Kenya so that their new regulation encouraged providers to separate and be much more explicit in how disclosure was provided to consumers.
Okay, I'm going to move to our lightning round here because I want to hear from every one of you. So please thank you for solving all of the problems that we have today in these notes. Everyone take their notes. They're going to solve our problems for us. So I'm going to ask each one of you, and I'm going to start with you, Juan Carlos. What's the number one thing that governments and regulators should do that may not be part of their normal repertoire to reach and to educate consumers? What innovation should governments and regulators take in this regard?
So number one is put yourself in the average consumer's shoes. Put real customers at the center of your actions. Sometimes I'm a former supervisor, and sometimes we just think about the system, the institutions, the soundness of them. But don't take the next step of thinking about what consumers are experiencing. And for us to change that mindset, we need to be able to better listen to the consumers, to get their insights, to get their feedback, to call them and hear them through different channels, through consumer surveys, through consumer panels, through listening better to the actual experience of consumers and how they are using financial services. If we can do that, we can make a big change in their experience with financial services.
I love that. I'm going to pop over the same question to you, Priya. What can we do from governments and regulators to really push our repertoire in research and educating?
So one, I'm going to say two things. Just
Yes.
one, we need to stop thinking of education as the panacea. You know, we tend to be like, well, okay, we're going to educate people. They're going to. So your frog question, for instance, I mean, it's a totally good question. Like, how do we educate people, you know, so that they don't get defrauded? On the other hand, Lehman Brothers, Charles Ponzi, Enron, you know, I could go. I mean, there was a survey last year of 1,300 executives across 53 regions of the world, and 30% of large businesses have been disrupted by fraudsters globally. I mean, so what's the average person going to do?
No.
Right? Like we're never going to be able to educate them enough, and it's just an unreasonable expectation. So one, we need to create consumer protection and regulatory paradigms which take this into account, which don't say, oh, we're going to build this and then we're going to tell people about it.
Right.
We're just going to say, we're going to build it in a way that they don't even actually need to know. It's just going to protect them.
Yeah.
One. Two, we need to meet people where they are. I mean, let's be candid. Nobody gets up on a Sunday morning and is like, let me spend 4 hours learning about financial literacy today. It's going
Actually,
to be
there's
a
a
great
few
day.
people here who might actually do that, but they're all in this room. I'm just saying.
Yeah, well, yeah, it's fair. But so we're not, I mean, we just need to be realistic about what is compelling about financial literacy and what is not compelling about financial literacy, and then take that and show up in places where people are to make it compelling. So the vast majority of youth are on TikTok.
Yeah.
We need to be on TikTok.
Yeah.
The vast, we need to sort of step out of our one size fits all, this is how you teach people stuff paradigms, and be like, okay, well, where are people at? And how do we show up there to help them in the situations that they're actually in?
Yeah, you do the TikTok dance. I will share that absolutely everywhere. Okay, so
Coming
same
up.
question, Stephen, to you. What can we do to push our normal repertoire into the next stage?
I think to piggyback on your point, it's, my thing is about public-private partnerships. So bringing all the stakeholders at one table on a regular basis to talk about some of the most egregious things that are happening in the industry. Mark was talking about the MGAs, and that's a new topic for me. But I think other people in industry knew kind of what was going on, and if they were all industry partners, including regulators, including law enforcement that's enforcing some of these actions, we're all sitting at the table, and advocacy groups. We had a health professional that was very emotional today because I think he felt like his voice wasn't being heard. So if him or other advocates were all in the same room with the regulators, a lot of the communication could get to the audiences a lot easier. And in a place where it's not an audit, where it's not enforcement, they're just openly talking and they have a forum to speak openly and solve the biggest problems in the industry.
You heard it there. This has been an extraordinary panel. We are open for questions. Judy, over to you.
I was on TikTok. And by the way, FSRA is on TikTok. So we've got 2 people that are going to take questions in the room. For those online, please email your questions in and we're going to read them old school in the room. If I don't see questions, I'll close my eyes and just point. I think that's fair.
Absolutely.
Thank you. There's one way in the back.
Thanks very much. My name is Bruce, and my question actually is about our parents. Some of us are actually the children that our parents come and ask us for help. And our parents are not very digitally literate, and they are often the target of fraud. And even when they're not target of fraud, they have processes that are increasingly designed for a digital age. So I recently had a 97-year-old relative whose spouse passed away, and like the process of getting a joint account was freed up, involved her going to stand in line. So what are we doing to protect that group? They're an increasing part of us. They're living longer, they have wealth, and they aren't digital. So what are we doing around that?
I think it's really important to know I did not plant that question. I'll pay you later. Okay. I know that when the FCAC started its very first financial literacy strategy, they paid a lot of attention to older people. And in fact, the very first area that you mobilized was on a suite of tools for older people. Maybe speak a little bit to what you're thinking about for older people right now. And then maybe I could share with you as well, like as you're thinking about consumer protections in an area where many people of any age don't really understand the lingo, how do we think through that, especially true for older people? So I'm going to turn it over to you, Supriya. Just maybe talk a little bit about how this reinvigorated strategy is thinking about older adults within this context. Thank you for the question.
Thank you, and thank you for the question. So I'll say that, so the strategy, takes very much there's no one-size-fits-all approach, and that we need to tailor what we do to the people that we are doing it for. And older people obviously have specific needs that we need to tailor our content, our materials, our interventions, our experiments, all of that. So in one, we are doing that. Two, the strategy lays out, so the strategy is an ecosystem approach. It's basically saying, this is a football game, you have to kick the ball, soccer. I grew up in India, I called it football. A soccer game, you're gonna get further if you pass the ball. Building financial well-being, financial resilience is a collective responsibility for everybody in the ecosystem, so we all need to take action. And it lays out specific actions that different ecosystem stakeholders can take to advance the goals, also including goals about digital access, digital literacy, or products that are built for specific diverse needs, such as those of older adults. And then the last thing is, so the strategy, the strategy is called Make Change That Counts, lays out what stakeholders can do. And this was published in 2021. This year, in November, Financial Literacy Month, we published the strategy's measurement plan, which is called Counting Change. See what we did there?
I know.
Change that counts, counting change.
It's funny.
Which speaks to how can we measure whether or not what we're doing is effective, and speaks to the outcomes point that Juan Carlos was also making. We're very focused on outcomes. And in the digital context in particular, one of the biggest advantages we have is that we can test quite expeditiously and quickly what does work and what doesn't work. And so specifically for older adults as well, we are testing or partnering with various ecosystem stakeholders to test interventions or initiatives that would help them make better financial decisions online.
But it's such an important question. All right, over to you.
It's funny when you said we're reading my bio and like people were giggling about it. Like contextual was one of the things included in my bio. And I think that's what we need to do is make more contextual content, scenario-based content about some of the scams and frauds that are going on. So if it's elderly people, walk them through some of the scenarios of they're new antivirus on their computer, what the scammers are doing. If it's cryptocurrency, are you investing in cryptocurrency that that hasn't been vetted, there hasn't been due diligence. So I think that's what we can do. And even whether it's indigenous community or the Black community or elderly, taking these groups and providing specific contextual scenarios on what's happening in their community, they're more likely to look at them and see themselves there. And I think you talked about optimism bias. If you see yourself in that situation, some of that information soaks in a little bit more.
It really does. I have a solution to one thing you can all do tomorrow. Make your font bigger, okay? Do you know that the average font size any adult can read in Canada is 14, and for me, maybe 16? If you can't read it, or you can't hear it, you can't absorb it. And so I would offer that regulators have been at the forefront, and FSRA is one of them, that has really been thinking about age-inclusive practices. And I really want to credit the Consumer Office here for taking that very seriously. It is going through a full age-inclusive audit, so all the information that goes out. And from the information sector, the content delivery, again, that personification, I think, is really important, because all they hear is like blah, blah, blah. Many of us will mentally turn off with too many words. So more words does not mean more disclosure. Understandability and relatability, I think, matters. This has been just the most terrific panel. Please join me in thanking my wonderful guests today.